I've sat in this worn armchair for years, its fabric faded yet familiar, much like the memories that swirl in the corners of my mind. There's a warmth here, but it's often overshadowed by the chill of loneliness. As I weave through my thoughts, I can still hear the echoes of my childhood, a time when innocence was stripped away by the sound of sirens and the fear of what lay beyond our village in Pennsylvania. At just 11 years old, I fled a war-torn home, my tiny heart laden with the weight of abandonment. I remember the faces, some familiar, some lost to the chaos, but what haunts me most is the silence of those I loved, their voices drowned out by the horrors surrounding us. I thought I had escaped, but the ghosts of my past linger, whispering secrets I've never shared. They remind me that sometimes survival comes with a price. Before I go on, subscribe to the channel. Here we tell stories no one else does. Stories of grandmas and grandpas the world tried to silence. I can still picture the small house where I grew up, nestled among the rolling hills of Pennsylvania, surrounded by farms and fields that seemed to stretch on forever. The gentle sway of corn stalks and the quiet rustling of leaves were the backdrop of my childhood, a world far removed from the chaos and clamor of war. The air was filled with the sweet scent of wildflowers in spring and the crisp, earthy smell of fallen leaves in autumn. It was a peaceful place where laughter echoed through our backyard during summer afternoons, and the simple pleasures of life were never taken for granted. Our small community was close-knit, and everyone knew each other's names, faces, and stories. I often sat on the creaky porch steps, my bare feet hanging over the edge, watching as neighbors waved to one another, exchanging news and gossip over picket fences. The image of my mother carrying a basket of freshly baked bread to share with Ms. Thompson down the street is forever etched in my memory. It was a time of innocence, where the biggest worry was whether the ice cream truck would make it to our street before the sun set. I felt safe, cradled in the warmth of my family and the familiarity of our surroundings. But shadows lurked in the corners of my mind, whispers of something larger than me, something that would ultimately shatter the fragile peace I had known. The world outside my little bubble was evolving, changing in ways I couldn't fully comprehend. While my days were spent chasing fireflies and playing hopscotch, the radio at home crackled with reports of a conflict that seemed miles away, yet the weight of it felt heavy on my small shoulders. I remember glancing at my parents' faces, concern etched across their brows, their voices hushed as they spoke about events I wasn't meant to understand. The word war was foreign, yet it carried an urgency that somehow seeped into our lives. Then one morning, everything changed. I awoke to a somber atmosphere. A heavy silence hung in the air, unlike any I had ever experienced. My parents were talking in low voices, their faces drawn and tense. I could feel the air thick with unspoken fears, as if the walls themselves could sense the tension. I had never seen my father so serious, his usual laughter replaced with a grim resolve. I sat on the edge of my bed, clutching my worn-out teddy bear, and listened, feeling helpless and afraid. The news whispered through the cracks in the door, a prophecy of what was to come, and I had no idea how those adult worries would soon encapsulate my very existence. With each passing day, the realities of our situation became clearer. Our little town, once a sanctuary of comfort, was transforming into a place rife with uncertainty. Neighbors began to disappear, families gathering their belongings and leaving without so much as a word. The laughter that had once filled the streets fell silent, giving way to the haunting sounds of sirens and distant explosions. I watched with wide eyes as my childhood slipped from my grasp, the joyous memories replaced by a stark understanding that innocence is a fragile thing, easily crushed by the weight of the world. I could feel the change in the air, the anticipation of loss, and I knew deep down that my life would never be the same again. I often find myself drifting back to the days when I was just a girl, an 11-year-old with wild dreams and a heart full of innocence. Back then, I was leaping through fields of wildflowers, my laughter mingling with the sound of rustling leaves. I was a child, wholly unaware of the darkness that loomed on the horizon. The name my family called me was Liesel, and by that name, I embodied the spirit of my mother's garden, bright and alive with possibility. I would spend countless hours tending to the flowers, coaxing their colors to bloom while weaving stories about adventures I would embark on one day. I was a dreamer, wrapped in the warmth of my family's love and safety. But the world turned cold on a fateful day that etched its mark upon me forever. The laughter was silenced as a thunderous noise echoed through our town, shattering the peace we had taken for granted. It was war, an unfathomable beast that brought destruction and despair. In my small world, chaos erupted, flipping my childhood upside down. I remember clutching my mother's hand, feeling her palms sweaty and trembling as we navigated the fear and confusion surrounding us. I was no longer Liesel, the carefree girl. I quickly became a witness to the brutality of a world at war. I had to grow up quickly, as innocence slipped through my fingers like sand. The decision to escape was not mine alone. It was a necessity driven by the instinct to survive. I still remember that fateful night, the way the stars shone brightly above us, unaware of the darkness enveloping our lives. We fled under the cover of darkness, the only sound being the soft rustling of our footsteps on the ground. In my heart, I carried not only my own fear, but also the weight of the love for my family. As we escaped, my dreams of adventures were replaced by a singular goal: to reach safety, to find a place where laughter could once again fill the air. The journey was harrowing, filled with uncertainty, but it became my new reality, an endless expedition fraught with danger, yet illuminated by the flickering hope of survival. Now, in my twilight years, I look back and see the layers of who I am. The experiences shaped the woman I grew to become. I carry scars, not just on my skin, but within my soul. Those wounds remind me of the resilience I found within myself, the strength birthed from surviving a childhood lost to war. There are days when the memories creep in, uninvited, flooding my mind with images of panic and fear, of running through darkened streets alongside strangers, seeking refuge in the arms of a world unknown. Yet, through it all, I learned the value of compassion and the importance of holding on to hope, even when the odds seem insurmountable. Today, I am not just a survivor, but a storyteller, with every wrinkle on my face etched by the tales of my past. I've come to understand that the girl I once was still resides within me, intertwined with the woman I am today. I carry her dreams, her laughter, and her spirit as I continue on this journey. I have transformed, but I have never forgotten. Each morning, I wake up with gratitude for the life I built from the ashes of my childhood, a life woven from the threads of joy and sorrow. I am Liesel, a warrior of peace, a keeper of stories, and in my heart, I hold the memories of all those who never made it to safety, a reminder of the importance of compassion that blooms in the darkest of times. I can still remember the mornings when the sun would rise and cast a warmth on our little village, a warmth that didn't last long once the air thickened with fear. It was as if the world had shifted beneath our feet, turning a once peaceful place into a battleground overnight. The change began subtly at first, like the way clouds gather for a storm. You see them accumulating, but for a while, you think they might pass and leave you be. My home in Pennsylvania had once been a haven filled with laughter, bustling markets, and chatter that brought the town to life. The adults were always busy, while we children played games in the fields, completely unaware of what lay ahead. I was only 11 when the whispers started. It began in hushed tones, conversations that would stop abruptly when a child approached. I remember the day my mother returned from market, her face pale and drawn, clutching a parcel of bread that seemed suddenly heavier than before. She gathered the family, her voice trembling as she spoke of rumors, soldiers entering neighboring towns, families fleeing. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach, an instinctual understanding that our lives were about to change forever. Fear had seeped in like a thief in the night, stealing away our innocence and replacing it with a sense of dread I could hardly comprehend. Then came the day the soldiers marched in. They arrived like a storm, and I can vividly recall the banging on our door, the shouting, and the chaos that erupted thereafter. My father was a proud man, strong and unyielding, yet in that moment I saw him falter. The soldiers wanted men to fight, to defend a cause we didn't fully understand. They didn't care that my father had a family to feed, nor did they consider the fear reflected in the eyes of his children. They took him away, and with that, the last thread of normalcy unraveled in an instant. I remember clutching my little brother's hand as we stood in the doorway, our minds swimming in confusion. Days turned into weeks, and the soldiers became more frequent in our lives, visiting our neighborhood and enforcing rules that suffocated us. The laughter that once filled our streets grew quieter, replaced by a heavy silence that engulfed us. I watched as neighbors packed their belongings, desperate to escape the tightening grip of war. Each family that left felt like a page torn from the history we had known, and with every departure, the sense of hopelessness grew. I saw mothers weep, fathers rage against the cruel hand of fate, and children, like me, grappling with a reality that was far too heavy for our young hearts to bear. It was during one of those silent nights as I lay in bed that I resolved to leave. The thought filled me with both terror and a glimmer of hope. I didn't want to abandon my family, yet staying felt more dangerous than the unknown that awaited. I began to formulate a plan in my mind, driven by an instinct to survive. I could still hear my mother's lullabies echoing in my ears, reminding me of the strength I had inherited. I resolved to escape this war, to find safety for myself and my little brother. I needed to be brave, for him, for my family. In those fragile moments, the determination blossomed within me, and with it came a daunting clarity. I would not let fear dictate my fate. No matter how young I was, I felt the weight of responsibility settling on my small shoulders, and I knew I had to act before it was too late. The distance often felt insurmountable. When I look back on those early days after I fled my home, everything seemed impossibly far away. The faces I loved, the familiar streets of my village, and the comforting sounds of my mother's voice. All of it had been lost to the chaos of war. Each mile I traveled pushed me further from the life I knew, weaving an intricate web of silence that stretched from the heart of my homeland to the alien ground I found myself on. The quiet was overwhelming. It wrapped around me like a heavy fog, pressing down with an unbearable weight that made every breath a reminder of what I had escaped, but also what I had lost. The silence became a companion, one whose presence was both a comfort and a torment. At times, I longed for the laughter of my friends, the clamor of our games, the warmth of my family gathered around the dinner table. I missed the mundane sounds that filled my days, the clinking of pots and pans, the chatter of neighbors discussing the weather or the latest gossip. Now, in this new place, outside the fences of a refugee camp, I found myself adrift in a sea of blank faces and unfamiliar tongues. Each moment I spent in that silence was a reminder that I was alone, a child who had been thrust into a world that felt as cold as the concrete beneath my feet. Communicating with others became a challenge, exacerbated by a language barrier that stretched wider than the physical distances I had traveled. I watched as older children spoke quickly, their laughter ringing out like music, while I stood in the shadows, lost in the cacophony of words I could hardly understand. My heart ached with a sense of longing so profound that it felt like a physical pain. There was a deep-rooted fear that if I didn't find a way to bridge that gap, if I couldn't learn to speak, to connect, I would be swallowed entirely by that deafening silence, drifting further into the alien landscape that surrounded me. The nights were the hardest. Under the blanket of stars, I would lie on the hard ground, listening to the sounds that echoed around me. The rustling of leaves, the distant murmurs of voices, the occasional cry of a child. All of it seemed to blend into a symphony of isolation. I would close my eyes and try to summon memories of home, the warmth of summer evenings spent chasing fireflies, the sweet scent of blooming roses in the garden. Yet, each time I reached for those memories, they slipped further away, like grains of sand slipping through my fingers. In the dark, the silence became alive with my thoughts, and I often found myself wondering if anyone would ever remember me back home, or if I had become just another ghost in the echoes of war. I remember once, during those oppressive nights, a woman who shared my tent turned to me. Her voice was a whisper, yet it cut through the silence, bringing a flicker of connection. She spoke of her own journey, the pain of separation, and in that moment, the distance between us seemed to shrink. It was as if, by sharing our stories, We could stitch together the fabric of our shattered lives, creating a small patch of warmth and understanding amidst the chaos. We sat there, exchanging fragments of our past, and for the first time, the silence felt less like a barrier and more like a bridge, allowing us to connect, to hold on to fragments of hope in a world that had shown us so little. But still, at the end of the day, when the conversations faded and we returned to our separate thoughts, the silence would settle back in, reminding me of the vast chasm that remained. I often think back to that day when my world shifted entirely. It was the first time I truly understood the weight of loss. I was only 11, still a child in so many ways, yet carrying the burden of survival that no child should have to face. We gathered in the small village square, whispered voices mixing with the sharp crack of gunfire in the distance. The air was thick with fear and uncertainty, but I remember how we clung to each other, hoping that somehow everything would be all right. My heart raced, and I felt as if it were pleading for the chaos to stop, for things to go back to the way they were. But then, as the chaos grew closer, I heard the shouts that would forever haunt me. Adults were yelling for their children, and the sound pierced through me like a dagger. I turned to see my mother's face, eyes wide with terror, and that's when I knew something was horribly wrong. She grabbed my hand, squeezing it tightly as if she could transfer her courage into me. "Stay close," she said, but even her voice trembled. It was the first time I sensed that strength might not be enough to keep us safe. I could see the fear etched into her features, a reflection of the chaos surrounding us. As a child, I had always felt invincible, but in that moment, vulnerability washed over me like an icy wave. The moments that followed unfolded in a blur. People were shoving, trying to find safety amidst panic. I lost sight of everything familiar. The fragrant gardens where I used to play, the laughter of my friends, the warmth of my home. Yet, it was the moment I turned to find my mother gone that the first real blow hit me, shattering my fragile world. I looked around, the faces of frantic strangers becoming masks of despair. I called out for her, my small voice swallowed by the growing cacophony. In that heartbeat of silence, I felt the first flicker of abandonment, a cold realization that my life was spiraling out of control. It was a whirlwind from then on. I found myself swept along with the crowd, desperate to find her, but the sea of adults and children pushed me along like debris in a storm. I could hear the sirens blaring, the distant thud of explosions, and yet it felt as though time froze around me. A part of me was still a child, wishing to wake up from this nightmare, while another part was suddenly aware of the harsh realities of life. I was just a girl, yet I felt as if I were being dragged into adulthood by circumstance, forced to navigate a path fraught with danger and uncertainty. I can still feel the texture of the worn coat I clutched into my chest, a flimsy comfort in a world where everything I knew was being ripped away. When the crowd finally began to settle, I found myself in a foreign place, away from the village I loved. I was alone, trembling, not because of the cold, but from the sting of that first emotional blow. I learned that day that safety is a fragile illusion, and love can be ripped away in an instant. The days that followed were filled with confusion, more fear, and the desperate search for my mother. I had no idea what lay ahead, just the haunting echo of my own voice crying her name. Little did I know, this was only the beginning. My childhood was gone, and the path of a refugee was now mine to tread, leading me further into the unknown. I often sit by the window in my sunroom, sipping on my lukewarm tea, watching the world outside bustle along, as though it were a different lifetime. Somehow, the leaves outside, rustling in the wind, seem to echo the whispers of a past that I've kept tucked away. And yet lately, I find those whispers growing louder, demanding to be heard. It was during one of these quiet afternoons that a simple letter changed everything. It arrived without warning, its edges worn and frayed, carrying with it the scent of old paper and memories I thought I had buried deep. The return address, scrawled in an unfamiliar hand, sent a jolt through my heart. It was from a distant relative, someone I barely knew, and yet the name drew me back to that war-torn place I had long since tried to forget, my home in Europe. With trembling hands, I opened the letter, and as I read, the words transported me back to the night that changed my life forever. I could nearly hear the distant sounds of gunfire, the screams echoing in my ears as they had when I was just 11 years old, caught in the chaos of a world unraveling. The letter spoke of family history, of lost connections, and then there it was, a mention of a secret, a part of my past that had been hidden even from me. It told of a brother I had never met, lost in the fray as families were torn apart, as war swallowed innocence whole. My heart raced. A brother? How could I have forgotten? How could I not have known? My mind flooded with images of my childhood, fleeting moments together, lost to years of trauma and sorrow. I remembered being told that I was all that remained of my family, but perhaps I wasn't as alone as I believed. This revelation made my heart ache and swell all at once, a mix of hope and grief spiraling within me. I could feel the old secret rising to the surface, demanding to be acknowledged. For so long, I had worn my memories like a cloak, heavy and burdensome, ashamed of the survival that had come at such a high price. The guilt of leaving a brother behind twisted like a knife in my heart. It was easier to forget, to silence the part of me that wondered about him, that yearned for connection. But now, thanks to a letter from someone I barely knew, I was faced with the possibility of seeking him out, of uncovering the truth of his fate. Could I bear to dig into that grief once more? As I sat there, staring out into the vibrant autumn colors of the trees, I realized that the world didn't stop for my secrets. Life had continued unfazed while I hid behind my carefully constructed walls. But could I, at this ripe age, find the courage to confront my past? Could I open that door, knowing the pain that lay behind it? My heart raced at the thought of delving deeper into the family I had lost, the brother I had believed to be an illusion. What if he was still out there waiting for me, even after all these years? I felt the weight of the decision. Should I clutch onto my memories, forever keeping them locked away, or dare to step into the unknown? I took a deep breath and closed my eyes, allowing myself for just a moment to envision what it might be like to find him, to know that I wasn't truly alone in this world. The prospect of possible connection filled me with dread and anticipation. The choice pressed heavily upon me, a crossroads that lay just beyond the threshold of my sunroom. The leaves danced outside, and in their rustling, I believed I could hear the echoes of the past, calling me toward a future that felt both frightening and liberating. I had to choose. Do I remain a solitary survivor, or do I take a step into the light of reunion? I often sit in my small, sunlit kitchen, the light dancing across the worn linoleum floor as I reminisce about my childhood in Pennsylvania. The scent of freshly brewed tea fills the air, yet the warmth of the sun cannot dispel the chill that creeps into my bones when I think of my journey as a child refugee. Escaping war is a wound that never truly heals, and though I've spent decades trying to build a life filled with joy and love, that wound is always there, a quiet companion lingering in the background. At 11 years old, the world was supposed to be full of promise and discovery, but for me, it was a cacophony of chaos. It was a time when laughter with friends on the playground was overshadowed by sirens and the sound of gunfire echoing through the streets of my hometown. I was just a child, yet I had to grow up too quickly, forced to clutch my mother's hand as we ran through the smoke and flames. I can still hear the crackling of the buildings and the terrified screams. The innocence of my youth was consumed by fear and uncertainty, a sharp contrast to the childhood I was supposed to have. When we managed to escape, I felt a surge of hope that was quickly smothered by the reality of our new life as refugees. The journey to safety was fraught with obstacles, and the faces of those I had to leave behind often haunt my dreams. There were moments of kindness, yes, but there were also looks of suspicion and judgment as we navigated unfamiliar towns and strange cultures. I remember the confusion in the eyes of other children when they heard my accent, felt the sting of exclusion when they shunned me at play. I longed for acceptance, for a place to belong, but my new reality felt like a permanent exile. As I grew older, I tried to put those memories away, as if shoving them into a box would somehow make the pain less real. I created a life for myself, married, had children, and drank in their joy. But even amid laughter, I often felt an ache in my heart, a longing for a sense of normalcy I never truly grasped. That unhealed wound would flare up unexpectedly. A news report recounting conflict in distant lands, a sudden smell in the air that transported me back to those dizzying days of escape. It's a reminder that my heart carries a burden, one that my loved ones may not always fully understand. Now, as I sit with my grandchildren around the table, I strive to pass on lessons of resilience and the importance of kindness to combat the darkness I have known. They play freely, unaware of the shadows that sometimes flicker across my memory, and I smile at their innocence. But deep down, I am left with the knowledge that the scars of my childhood cannot be erased. They are a part of who I am, shaping my understanding of the world, infusing my words with empathy. The wound may never heal completely, but perhaps I can soften its edges by sharing my story with those willing to listen, turning a painful past into a beacon of hope for those who face similar struggles today. The day unfolded like any other, calm and ordinary. I shuffled about my sunlit kitchen, the familiar smell of herbs mingling with the warmth of freshly baked bread. At 85, my life is woven with threads of memory, some frayed but cherished, others sharp and vivid. I often lose myself in thoughts of the past, especially those dark days when I was just a girl fleeing from the turmoil that engulfed my homeland. Today, however, the mundane would give way to something I never anticipated. It was a crisp autumn afternoon when the doorbell rang. The sound jolted me from my reverie, and as I approached the door, a flutter of nerves danced in my chest. I hadn't expected visitors. Adjusting my sweater, I opened the door to find a young woman standing there, holding a bouquet of wildflowers. I squinted at her, trying to place her in the cobwebbed corners of my memory, but it was like trying to catch smoke with bare hands. Her dark hair was tied back in a loose braid, and she wore a friendly smile that warmed the chill of the day. "Hello, I'm Clara," she said, her voice bright and cheerful. "I hope I'm not bothering you. I'm working on a project about family histories, and I've come across your name." My heart raced. The warmth of nostalgia washed over me, and yet I felt a wave of trepidation as I searched for an answer in her eyes. "My grandmother was a refugee too," she continued, a hint of longing in her tone. "She escaped from the same village as you did." As she spoke, waves of emotion crashed against the jagged shores of my heart. I felt a connection, an invisible thread binding us together despite the decades that separated our experiences. "Your grandmother?" I whispered, instantly curious. Would she be a sister from another time? A fellow traveler in the storm? Clara nodded, her eyes lighting up with enthusiasm as she explained how her grandmother had often recounted stories of her childhood during the war. I listened intently, hanging on to each word as if they were pieces of a puzzle that had long been missing. Suddenly, memories long buried began to resurface. The terrified looks on my mother's face, the sound of gunfire echoing through our village, and the frantic journeys across treacherous terrain. I shared snippets of my life, the fear, the loss, and the moments of fleeting joy that punctuated the darkness. Clara's eyes glistened with empathy as she nodded, understanding blooming between us. As we sat together at my kitchen table, the wildflowers between us vibrant and alive, we began to exchange stories, her grandmother's tales intertwining with mine. I felt an odd sensation, a sort of bittersweet ache, as I recounted how my sister and I had been separated during our escape, and how I had spent years searching for her. I could see the impact my words had on Clara. She leaned in closer, her expressions shifting between disbelief and compassion. "My grandmother always said she lost touch with some of her family too," Clara murmured, her voice heavy. "But she never stopped looking. She believed that one day they would reunite." This hope hung in the air, floating like a fragile bird, and ignited something deep within me. That day unfolded as a tapestry woven with threads of shared loss and fragile hope. When Clara finally left, I hugged her tightly, as if to bridge the gaps of time and distance that had separated us. We promised to keep in touch, and I could feel the weight of decades lift slightly, replaced by a dawning sense of connection. For the first time in years, the idea of searching for my sister seemed less daunting, a flicker of resolve igniting within me. As I closed the door behind her, I stood quietly, watching the leaves swirl outside. a symbol of the seasons changing. I realized, with a bittersweet pang, that sometimes the most unexpected reunions can emerge from the ashes of trauma, illuminating paths toward healing that felt like long-lost friends. I remember the day everything changed, the day I found myself standing in that dimly lit room, surrounded by shadows of my past. The air was thick with the scent of damp walls and memories, and I could hear the distant echoes of children laughing, a sound that felt almost foreign now. It was there, in that small, crowded space, where the weight of my past pressed down on my chest, threatening to suffocate me. I had lived with the ghosts of my childhood for so long, as if they were a second skin, but that day I was finally ready to confront them. The room was filled with people, all bearing stories of loss, survival, and resilience. We were refugees, each of us carrying our own burdens, and as I looked around, I saw my reflection in their faces: anguish, hope, fear, and a longing for understanding. I had spent years in silence, afraid to share the horrors I had witnessed as a child during the war. But something shifted within me that day. Perhaps it was the stories I heard, or maybe it was the tears pooling in the eyes of a young mother sitting across from me that stirred something deep inside. I realized that I was not alone in this struggle. We were a tapestry woven from pain, yet somehow there was strength in our shared experiences. As I stood before the group, my hands trembling, I could feel the fear creeping back in. What if they didn't understand? What if my memories were too raw, too dark for them to bear? But in that moment, I thought of the little girl I used to be, the one who had learned to stay silent, to hide from the world outside. I took a deep breath and started to share my story, each word a release, untangling years of tightly wound emotions. I could feel their eyes on me, waiting for me to go on, and I knew that this was my chance to let go of the burden I had carried for so long. I spoke of the day I lost everything, the day the bombs fell like rain, and I was forced to flee my home. I described the panic that coursed through me as I shuffled through the rubble, the confusion etched on the faces of those around me. I recounted my journey alone, the nights spent huddled under makeshift shelters, the hunger gnawing at my insides. The words poured out of me, and as I spoke, I could feel the tension in my chest begin to ease, the weight of the past lifting little by little. I dared to look around the room, and I saw tears glistening in the eyes of others who understood, who had lived through their own versions of hell. In those moments of sharing, I felt a flicker of hope igniting within me. Perhaps this was what I had been searching for, a way to connect with others who bore the scars of war, a way to say, I am still here. I was no longer just the girl who escaped. I was a woman who had survived and thrived despite the odds. There was power in letting the emotions swell to the surface, in acknowledging the hurt while also embracing the strength that came from survival. As the room filled with quiet nods and murmurs of solidarity, I knew that I was seen, truly seen, for the first time. By the end of my story, I felt a lightness in my step. It was as if I had unpacked a heavy suitcase I had carried for decades, one filled with sorrow and pain, but also with resilience and courage. As the room erupted into supportive conversation, I found comfort in knowing that my voice mattered, that sharing my pain could help others find their own. For the first time in many years, I felt a sense of closure beginning to blossom, a promise that the past, while a part of me, would not define my future. I realized then that confronting the shadows did not mean walking alone. I had found my tribe, and together we would carry our stories forward, not as a burden, but as a testament to the power of survival. I remember the day I made the choice to leave. It was not something I had dreamed of, nor was it a decision made lightly. I was just 11 years old, but the echoes of gunfire had become the grim soundtrack of my childhood. I felt as if I were an old woman, trapped in a child's body, burdened with fears that far exceeded my years. My parents, with their anxious faces, had prepared me for the worst. Each night, my mother would sit at my bedside and whisper stories of a safer place, a land where the sun shone brightly and laughter still filled the air. My little brother, Thomas, sat in the corner with his toy soldiers, oblivious to the looming dread that surrounded us. I would often watch him and wish I could fade away into his innocence, where the only battles were fought in imagination. But war threatened to invade even the sacred space of our home. One evening, the sounds of chaos grew closer. That night, I made a decision that would change my life forever. I told myself if I didn't act, I would lose everything I loved. As night fell, I slipped out of the house, carefully avoiding the creaky floorboards that would give me away. My heart raced with the rhythm of 1,000 drums, a cacophony of fear, hope, and uncertainty. Leaving without a word felt like a betrayal, but I knew the dangers that awaited us all if I stayed. I had to go, had to find a way to ensure Tomas's future. The street outside was dark and deserted, but the distant sounds of gunfire were enough to guide me. With nothing more than a small knapsack filled with food, water, and a photograph of my family, I began the journey that would take me far from everything I had ever known. I traveled for what felt like days, my legs weary, but my spirit ignited by a flicker of hope. Each time I rested, I would unroll that photograph, tracing my fingers over my parents' faces, reminding myself of whom I was fighting for. I found myself in a group of other refugees, many of whom were also young children. There was a strange comfort in our shared despair, children banding together, speaking a language that needed no words. We became a makeshift family, sharing our meager supplies, and for the first time since the war began, laughter occasionally bubbled up among us, sweet but fleeting. But just when I thought I had found safety, life threw me another curveball. One of the older boys, a brave soul with wild hair and kind eyes, led us to a deserted building where we could rest for the night. We nestled in the shadows, shivering not just from the chill, but from the uncertainty of what tomorrow would bring. The more I listened to his stories of escape and resilience, the more I realized that courage came in many forms. Yet, as sleep began to take me, the world outside shattered the peace. We awoke to the sound of boots pounding outside, crashing through the doors, voices roaring in anger. In an instant, my heart sank. I felt the warmth of the group dissolve into cold fear, like ice water rushing through my veins. The adults were there, but they weren't here to protect us any longer. The memory of my brother flashed before me, innocent and playful, and I knew I couldn't let him down. With a sudden surge of determination, I did the unexpected. I grabbed Thomas's hand and ran. We burst through the back door into the night, leaving behind the safety I thought we had found. The darkness enveloped us, but it no longer felt like a shroud of despair. It became a cloak of possibility. I remember the day I returned to our village, a place transformed by conflict. The echoes of laughter and the warmth of familiar voices had faded, replaced with whispers of loss and uncertainty. I was just 11 years old, a child trying to grasp what it meant to be alone in a world that had so suddenly become unfriendly. My family had sacrificed so much for me to be safe, and yet the absence of their presence weighed heavily on my heart. I often wondered if my survival came at an unbearable cost, and I grappled with the duality of relief and sorrow that came with escaping war. In the months that followed my escape, the world outside our home felt unfathomable. Strangers became my immediate companions, though they were kind enough to offer warmth and food. They were families themselves, people who had witnessed their own tragedies. They were supportive, gathered together like a patchwork quilt of shared pain and resilience. They spoke in hushed tones, their conversations often revolving around lost loved ones, the ones who never made it out, or the ones who hesitated and were left behind. In those moments, I realized that while I was physically safe, my spirit was tethered to the memories of my family who had chosen to stay. My relatives, who had managed to escape along with me, were my lifeline. We huddled together every night, sharing stories of our past lives, a bittersweet refuge from the harsh realities we faced. They did their best to shield me from the world outside, but I was always aware of the judging glances, the questions about why I had survived when so many others hadn't, why I was the one who got to start anew while they remained haunted by their losses. Their polite inquiries were layered with guilt, as if my living somehow overshadowed the grief that rested heavily on those who had lost so much. It wasn't long before I felt the weight of my survival mix with the scrutiny of society. I remember a woman at the market, her eyes narrowing as she questioned whether I truly deserved the scraps we were given. Did I not appreciate the kindness of those who took me in? Did I even know what it was like to struggle? Her words cut me deeply, igniting a fire of shame I had not anticipated. I was a child, fleeing chaos, yet it seemed there were expectations of me to carry the burdens of my survival on my shoulders, to somehow justify my existence in that foreign land. Even amongst my own community of refugees, whispers haunted my steps. There were moments when I overheard my relatives discussing how I might burden their resources or distract from their own grief. They debated whether I was a blessing or a curse, a reminder of what was lost or a glimmer of hope for the future. I felt like a ghost, floating through the realities of their pain. And while I longed to belong, I recognized that my presence was a constant reminder of their own suffering. The invisible walls between us were suffocating, leaving me yearning for the familial connections I had once taken for granted. At that moment, I realized that my journey toward healing was not just about physical safety, it was also about reconciling my own identity amid the shadows of loss that loomed ever large. Looking back, it's surreal how the memories of that time still flicker in my mind like a broken bulb. Sometimes it's just a shadow of a face, sometimes a loud bang, and other times it's the gentle hum of a lullaby meant to soothe me. The war had eclipsed my childhood, but there are moments that slip through like sunlight through the cracks of a closed door. When I recall the day I fled my home, I remember the sheer weight of my small backpack, a burden that felt heavier than any suitcase a grown man might carry. Although I was only 11, I instinctively understood that I had to leave everything behind. We all tell ourselves lies to make survival easier. I said it was just for a little while. The streets were riddled with uncertainty as I wandered, clutching my backpack like a lifeline. I felt as though I had stepped into a dream where nothing was familiar. The sights and sounds of my once vibrant neighborhood had morphed into a haunting echo. I had always been a timid child, content with my little world filled with friends and laughter. But suddenly, I was thrust into a reality that demanded resilience I didn't know I possessed. I found myself wearing the faces of strangers like a second skin, adopting their expressions to blend in, their grief woven into the fabric of my own. Each step I took felt like an act of rebellion against fear, against the darkness that threatened to engulf me. However, the struggle to stay hidden and alive took its toll. My heart raced, pounding in my chest like a war drum, always alert to sounds that might signal danger. I lost track of days, the hunger gnawing at my insides like an insatiable beast. I learned to scavenge, to search for remnants of yesterday's meals, and I took pride in the small victories, a half-eaten apple, a forgotten slice of bread. Yet with each morsel, I became more acutely aware that I had stepped unknowingly into a new narrative, one that was written by fear, sorrow, and loss. I transitioned from a carefree child to an unwilling participant in a story that felt foreign, yet all too real. As I traversed borders and made my way through refugee camps, I longed for a sense of home that seemed forever out of reach. I remember when I first came across other children like me. We were all marked by the same scars that the world could not see. We would huddle together, sharing bits of food and whispers of dreams, weaving tales of the innocent lives we longed to return to. It was in those fleeting moments of connection that I began to reclaim parts of myself buried deep under layers of fear. We drew strength from each other, a ragtag family forged in the fires of survival. Yet, the new world I found myself in was disorienting. Each kindness I received felt like a double-edged sword. Who was I to accept generosity while others suffered? I often battled with guilt, questioning whether I was deserving of the little comforts I encountered. The war may have left my body, but it lingered in my spirit, shaping my thoughts and decisions. I slowly learned that it was possible to hold grief and gratitude in the same heart. I began to understand that while the scars from my past would always be a part of me, they didn't have to define my future. Rediscovery became my quiet rebellion, a way to reclaim my narrative amid the chaos. It was then that I started to grasp that the survival of my spirit depended not just on enduring, but on embracing the possibility of joy, even in the wake of loss. As I sit here in my sunlit kitchen, the scent of freshly brewed tea swirling around me, I find my thoughts drifting back to that harrowing time when I was just 11 years old. The memories are like the worn pages of an old photo album, each image carefully preserved in my mind, though some are tinged with sorrow and shadows. I often replay the moments of my escape, the fears that gripped me, and the small triumphs I found along the way. My heart still aches for the life I left behind, but more than that, it longs for the connections that were severed so suddenly, like a thread pulled from a frayed garment. I think of my mother, her face etched with worry, yet filled with a fierce determination, as she made plans for my safety. She never fully understood why she had to send me away, but she knew the dangers that were creeping closer with each passing day. We hugged tightly before our parting, her tears dampening my cheek, and I felt a mix of fear and love, a potent cocktail that clung to me as I boarded that rickety bus. In those moments, I never comprehended how far-reaching the impact of separation would be. I was a child, just trying to grasp the idea of a future while clinging to the past. It was both my mother's will to save me and the war's cruelty that turned us into specters in each other's lives. As the bus jolted along the road, I was surrounded by other children, each with their own stories, their own losses. Much like an unspoken pact, we would share stolen glances and quiet whispers, the weight of our shared grief binding us. Yet, as I glanced at their faces, I felt an emotional barrier. I wanted to connect, to speak openly about our fears and aspirations, but the sense of loss was too overwhelming. It was a time when words felt inadequate, when hugs could not grasp the magnitude of our shared predicament. In that silence, I learned something about myself. Sometimes you can be alone in a crowd, even amidst those who have walked similar paths. Eventually, after what felt like lifetimes, I reached the safety of temporary shelter, as if the walls themselves could shield us from the storm raging outside. But refuge comes with its own complications. I was surrounded by caring adults, volunteers doing their best, yet I felt like an outsider peering through a window into a world I no longer belonged to. Conversations between others swirled around me, filled with hope and plans for the future. I felt like a ghost, a mere observer with no voice. I missed the simplicity of my childhood friendships and the warmth of familial bonds, wishing more than anything for a way back to the life I knew, yet accepting that it had vanished overnight. In the years that followed, as I settled into a new life, those memories shaped my understanding of relationships. I learned to build walls to protect myself from the pain of the past, but in doing so, I also shut out the possibility of reconnection. I found solace in friendships, yet I always held a part of myself back, fearful of what lay on the other side of vulnerability. It wasn't until much later, through the journey of healing, that I began to understand that resolution does not always mean reconciliation. I can cherish the beautiful moments I had with my family while accepting that some bridges may never be rebuilt. I carry their memories within me and honor their sacrifices by living a full life, albeit one colored by the echoes of sorrow and resilience. The weight of memories can be crushing, like a stone lodged deep within the chest, suffocating yet strangely familiar. I cannot help but think back to that fateful day when I took my first and last steps away from everything I had known. My heart was a cacophony of dread and anticipation, pounding like war drums as I trudged through debris-strewn streets. With each cautious footfall, I felt the world I had taken for granted slip further away, leaving only shadows and echoes behind. I was a child of just 11, but the war had stolen my innocence long before I learned how to escape it. As I fled, I carried only a tattered backpack filled with remnants of my old life, some clothes, a cherished stuffed bear that had seen better days, and a small locket containing my mother's picture. It hung heavy around my neck, a comforting weight that reminded me of love amidst chaos. I could hear the distant sounds of sirens wailing like lost souls, and I knew I had to move quickly. Hope can be a fickle companion in times of strife, yet it urged my little legs faster, away from the suffocating grip of my war-torn home. Each step was a plea for survival, a desperate reach towards a future I had no idea awaited me. In my mind, I had envisioned where I would eventually land. safe and sound perhaps, on the other side of darkness. But navigating through the unknown was a perilous journey, fraught with fear. I remember how the air felt electric with uncertainty. Each stranger I passed could be a potential ally or an unforeseen threat. I had to trust my instincts, and though I was young and alone, there was a flicker of resolve in my heart. With every inch I advanced, I was not just fleeing, I was also choosing to live, to hold on to the scraps of my childhood as best I could. After days of walking, I found myself at the border. It loomed before me like a massive wall, both a barrier and a gateway. I had left behind my family, my home, and the only life I had known. The stench of despair mingled with the hope of crossing into a new land. I clutched my bear tightly to my chest, the one piece of my past that could never leave me. It was a small gesture, but in that moment I decided to leave something behind as a final tribute. I placed the locket that had once hung around my neck into the palm of my bear, knowing that it would carry a piece of my story, a reminder of all I had lost. As I stepped over the threshold into the unknown, I glanced back one last time, a silent farewell to the life I had once cherished. The enormity of my loss hit me like a tidal wave, swallowing me whole and threatening to drag me under. But I steeled myself. I had to. I was no longer that innocent girl who played in the sunlit fields of my childhood. I had become a survivor, shaped by the scars of my past. Sometimes it feels like the world forgets those who have been left behind. Yet in that final act of letting go, I knew that I was carrying my home with me, not just as a memory, but as a testament to resilience, both for myself and for the child in each of us who deserves a chance to flourish in peace. I often find myself sitting in the dim light of the afternoon, watching shadows stretch across the walls, and I can't help but reflect on the tapestry of my life, each thread woven with struggle, heartache, and an enduring hope that sometimes feels almost like a forgotten song. At 11, I was just a child, yet the weight of my world was heavy enough to crush me. Fleeing a war-torn country feels like a story that belongs to someone else, but the memories are stitched into my very being. I remember the fear, the hunger, the relentless uncertainty of every day. Yet within that chaos, I discovered a strength I never knew existed. There are moments when I see my grandchildren playing, their laughter a stark contrast to my own childhood. I cannot help but feel a bittersweet pang in my heart. They are unaware of the cruelty that the world can hold, blissfully untouched by the violence that forced me to leave everything behind. If only I could shield them from the realities I endured, but I know that ignorance is not protection. It is simply a momentary ease. I share bits and pieces of my past with them, not to frighten them, but to remind them of resilience. Through my own struggles, I hope to teach them the importance of compassion and understanding, keys to surviving in a world that often seems so harsh. As I recount my journey, I can still taste the dust and feel the heat of the sun beating down as I navigated through crowded streets, dodging both danger and despair. My heart remained fragile, folding in on itself at every sound that echoed too close. A gunshot, a cry, the laughter of children that mirrored my own pain. In those years, I learned that hope was a small flame that flickered and sometimes waned, but never truly extinguished. I clung to it like a lifeline during the most desperate nights, and now, years later, I still nurture that flame within me, grateful for the paths it has illuminated. The passage of time has granted me perspective. I can now see that while I escaped the physical threat of war, the emotional scars remained. I've spent decades stitching myself back together, learning to embrace the woman I've become. Each wrinkle on my face tells a story. Each gray hair is a testament to the battles I have fought, not only against external forces, but within myself. I have taken the weight of my past and turned it into a strength. It has shaped the way I love my family and how I approach each day. Every morning I wake up with gratitude and a fierce determination to live fully, honoring those who lost their battles and those who still fight. While I have found peace in my later years, I carry with me the memory of that frightened little girl, alone and searching for safety. We are all shaped by our experiences, woven together by our histories and our choices. I realize now that my journey doesn't end with me. It deepens with every story I pass down. I hold my head a little higher, for I am not just a survivor. I am a testament to the human spirit, a spirit that can endure, adapt, and thrive. In sharing my story, I can only hope that I inspire others to find their strength, to recognize that even in the darkest times, there is still a light waiting to be kindled. I stand firm in my conviction that love, resilience, and hope can guide us home, wherever that may be. As I sit here, the gentle hum of the world continues around me, like a soft breeze that carries whispers of memory. The years have folded around me, each one a delicate layer of resilience, of love, and of loss. I often find myself drifting back to that time, the echoes of sirens and the shadows of fear still vivid in my heart. Yet, intertwined with those memories, there lies a profound sense of gratitude for the journey that followed. I may have been just a child then, alone in a foreign land, but I discovered strength I never knew I possessed. Life's tapestry is woven with threads of struggle and triumph, and I am proud to say that I have played my part. Each stitch, each moment, has shaped me, taught me the value of compassion, and reminded me of the importance of sharing our stories. As the sun sets on my days, I look back not with bitterness, but with calm acceptance. The past will always be a part of me, but it no longer defines me. If you listened until the end, thank you. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments which city you're watching from. Maybe the next story we tell here will be yours.